Dr. Subramanian Swamy. If there was a name to describe honesty, Dr. Subramanian Swamy would be it. This ethical and honorable leader that India is proud of is widely acknowledged. He holds a PhD in economics from the Harvard University, where he taught for 10 years, and is recognized internationally as an authority on the economy of China. Dr. Swamy has been elected 5 times to Parliament since 1974. From his very first day, he has maintained an attitude of forthrightness and has inculcated a positive mindset within people for the nation's identity as Hindustan. His experiences have been documented in the book Hindus Under Siege. We are proud to have this eminent personality and true leader with us today.
Thank you very much. I thank the management of the Managing Committee of the Indore Management Association for this opportunity to address you and congratulate you on the impressive ambiance of this conference. I know that the theme in your conference is on transformational leadership. And so I will first express my ideas on what I think is the requirement of leadership of the country today. And then I'll deal with some of the problems where there's leadership lacking and what needs to be done. Leadership is a multidimensional phenomenon in any society. 5 have been identified as crucial for a society. The first is political leadership. The second is administrative leadership. The third is military leadership. The fourth is economic leadership. And the fifth is academic or intellectual leadership. Long years ago, before people from abroad came and looted this country and occupied this country and controlled the government of this country, this leadership question has been debated thoroughly at all levels. The famous conversation between Bhishmacharya and Arjuna just after the battle, when Krishna asked Arjuna to go and take leadership lessons, has not been properly translated and put out in various languages of India as yet. But those who have had access or had the privilege of being taught about it, it contains enormous amount of wisdom. The debate between 2 great rishis of India, Rishi Bhrigu and Rishi Bhardwaj, on how society should be organized so that it can be led properly, is something that needs to be reconsidered in the light of the modern situation. What they implemented for our society has degenerated, ossified, and therefore in its present form, it's unrecognizable as what Rishi Bhardwaj and Rishi Bhrigu wanted. Rishi Bhrigu had said very clearly that there are 4 sources of power in a society. And therefore, these 4 sources of power should not vest in any one individual, even more than one should not vest in any one individual. And he identified these 4 sources of power as knowledge, weapons, wealth, and land. And he said that those who specialized or led in knowledge, they should not have wealth, they should not have weapons, but they will enjoy the best and the highest respect in society. This is what came to be known later on as the Brahmin, the Varna of Brahmin. Those who had weapons would preside over a kingdom, but they cannot declare war. They have to defer to those with knowledge for the declaration of war. They cannot dispense justice. For that, they have to again defer to those with knowledge of law. Those who had wealth will not have weapons, will not be in the field of knowledge, and their social status will not be determined by the amount of wealth they have. Those who till the land, they will do it for the sake of the country. And none of these would be connected with birth. The last time this was affirmed by divinity himself is Lord Krishna, when in Gita he says very clearly that the Varna system is based on gunas and not on birth. And that is why Veda Vyasa, who wrote the Mahabharata, his mother was a fisherwoman. He was not born of Brahmin parents. Yet he became Maharishi and wrote the Mahabharata. Valmiki is widely considered as belonging to the Dalit community. And he was, in fact, initiated by Goddess Saraswati herself. And he became a Maharishi and wrote the Ramayana. Those who were kept out of society for a variety of reasons, their children did not belong to that, outcasts of society. And Valmiki's case proves that. Kalidasa was the great poet, he was the Maharishi, and he was a hunter. And the Rishi of Rishis was Vishwamitra. His parents were Kshatriyas. Most prominent Brahmin I can think of is Ravan. Ravan was a Brahmin. And Ravan was not above the law, even though he was a Brahmin. He was killed by a Kshatriya, namely Lord Rama. And all those who claim themselves to be Brahmins do not hold that against Rama. In fact, they worship Rama for having killed Ravan. So it was a decentralization of power. And I think that's the way we need to now look at leadership. Transformational leadership can come to this country only if this concentration is not there. Unfortunately, the concentration is coming in a big way. People are now acquiring weapons, they are acquiring land, they are acquiring wealth. They may not or may not acquire knowledge, but they are certainly acquiring colleges and universities to own. So I think if we were to consider an ideal of how to create a transformational leadership, we have to go back to this concept. I'm not saying you need to have it in the same way, but this concept has to be accepted and adopted. Now, today, as I have identified 5 different aspects of leadership, as I said, political leadership, intellectual or academic leadership, administrative leadership, economic leadership, and military leadership. These 5, if we look at it in terms of being wheels, 4 of them move the state on those 4 wheels. And the 5th wheel is the steering wheel, and that is the political leadership. I would say that if one were to analyze India today, now in 2011, the 4 wheels are working quite well. Our economic leadership is recognized all over the world. We are acquiring companies which we never thought we would acquire. Even symbolically, some of them are very Heartwarming, for example, an Indian called Mehta has bought the East India Company. The company which bought India has been bought by an Indian now. Although there is not much left in it, but its properties are enormous in London. India, for the first time, has lent $10 million to the IMF. After decades of begging from the IMF for money, it became the turn of the IMF to beg for money from India, and we gave them $10 billion. Similarly, in administration, we have whatever its minuses, including occasionally discovering an IAS officer having crores and crores in 1,000-rupee notes in his bank vault, in his cupboard in his own home, especially in this state. But despite these examples, by and large, I would say we have one of the smartest, most educated civil service in the world. I myself, as a minister, I dealt with the civil service, and I came to the conclusion that the civil service is like a horse. It assesses the rider. If the rider doesn't know anything, then it throws off the rider and goes in the direction it wants. Generally speaking, people compete in examinations to get into the civil service. And whereas the political leadership they serve are people who haven't even passed a high school most of the time. Hence, the civil service, naturally faced with this dichotomy, sometimes goes out of control. You need a strong minister. Anytime a minister knows his job and deals with the civil service will perform. United States, the civil service is of very low quality, and certainly compared to India, very, very low quality. Because in America, only if you can't get a job anywhere in the world, anywhere else in the country, do they enter civil service. It's almost the job of last resort. Whereas in India, it's not yet the job of last resort, although this growing business and the demand for MBAs and so on has started having effects on the quality of the IAS. But the civil service is excellent. Even today, it can deliver goods if the minister is up to it. The military, for all the scandals you might see in the press, is still the finest military. And the interesting part of our military is that unlike all other armies of the world, in a war, for example, the last Kargil war, it is the captains and the lieutenant colonels who died in the largest numbers. Very, very rarely you will see in other militaries captains and lieutenant colonel ranks dying. Except for 1962, which was not a defeat, but a collapse of the political leadership, India has not been defeated on the battlefield. We've been defeated on the negotiating table, but never on the battlefield. And that's why I think that our military is still the finest. And finally, the intellectuals, I need hardly say, go to any American campus, you will see Indian professors, you will see Indian academicians, Indians heading research from companies. You go to the Silicon Valley, you will find 1/3 of the companies are Indians. Because of our deficiency in the upbringing, deficiency in our education, we are not innovative people. We can produce software, provided we know what kind of software the people who are contracting you want it. But we are not yet in a position to produce brands of software because our upbringing is that way. We are not innovative, we are not risk-taking, but in terms of native ability, we have demonstrated it all over the world. So these four wheels run well. But if the steering wheel is faulty, how can the car move? it will land you in the ditch. And if India is landed in a ditch today, it is because the steering wheel is faulty, and when you improve the steering wheel, the nation will move much faster ahead than we have done so far. I would say there have been transformational leaderships. If people ask me which of the prime ministers have been transformational, and honestly, to some extent, in terms of bringing the computer revolution, I would consider Rajiv Gandhi as a transformational leadership. Unfortunately, he got bogged down in issues of corruption. I would say that having worked with Narasimha Rao, he was a great transformational leadership. He provided that kind of leadership. Unfortunately, our media gave the credit to Manmohan Singh for economic reform. He had nothing to do with economic reform except to implement it as finance minister. The blueprints were supplied by me because I was the commerce minister before Mr. Narasimha Rao became prime minister. When Mr. Chandrasekhar was prime minister, my commerce secretary at that time was Montek Singh, and my economic advisor was Manmohan Singh. And Manmohan Singh very efficiently implemented whatever Mr. Rao wanted, but it was Mr. Rao's backing. The nation owes a debt of gratitude to Mr. Rao and recognize him sometimes in the future because his party has disowned him and reduced him, relegated him to the corners of history. But he transformed the country. He brought economic reform. Since I also held a ministerial rank position in his government, I was not a minister, but I was heading the GATT Commission, the WTO Commission with cabinet rank, attending his cabinet meetings. Only because I refused to join the Congress party, he said, I can't make you a minister, but I want you anyway. So he made me chairman of a commission with cabinet rank. And I know how every inch of the way he had to fight to bring in economic reform. People thought it was a sellout of the socialist principles with which Jawaharlal Nehru had brought this country forward. But the growth rate we achieved under socialism was only 3.5%. We copied the Soviet model. What happened to the Soviet model? I remember the communist called Namboodiripad once told me, in the heydays when there was a banking collapse in 1987 in the United States, he told me, see what's happened to your United States? It has collapsed. I said, what about Soviet Union? He said, in Soviet Union there is no unemployment. There is no poverty. There is no inflation. Because of press censorship, he could say that. But in August 1991, I reminded him that now there is no Soviet Union also. Soviet Union is broken up into 16 countries. That Soviet model should never have been accepted by us. And it is because of the Soviet model that we grew at 3.5%. And it is because of the economic reforms that came, we started growing first at double the rate, 7%, and now at 9%. And we can continue for quite some time to grow at these rates. So transformational leadership has also been provided to people who have not been prime minister. Sardar Patel was an example of a person who didn't become prime minister. In fact, he was denied prime ministership by Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. Mahatma Gandhi prevailed on him to make way for Jawaharlal Nehru. Perhaps one of his many Himalayan blunders, this was one of the Himalayan blunders. But he converted. What did the British leave you? They left you with 600 separate countries on the length and breadth of what we call India. 150 chose to merge with Pakistan. But 450 kingdoms, which constituted 2/3 of the then India. British India was only 1/3. 2/3 was under the princely kingdoms. Of course, administered by the regents of the British, but it was nevertheless independent. And on 1947, the Indian Independence Act, the British declared all of them as independent countries. And Sardar Patel used the classic methodology which Chanakya had said, Sama, Dama, Veda, Danda. He used all those 4 techniques and made each of them sign the instrument of accession. Only one country, Jawaharlal Nehru said, is my own and should be left to him, was Kashmir, and he made a royal mess of it, which we are still suffering for. Sardar Patel was that kind of leadership. I would say if 5 years Morarji Desai had lasted, he would have been a transformational leadership too. But nevertheless, this country doesn't recognize transformational leadership. And that is one thing that needs to be done. Those people who superficially, by using the media, created an image, emerged as transformational leaders, but they were not. Now, question is, what do we do about the future? The future is now for us not so bleak as many people think or by reading newspapers. But we have a major problem in our country. We have democracy and we have what we are trying to do, approach the free market. We have a market economy. It's still over-regulated. There needs to be more economic reforms, and we need to bring about major changes so that the country can be cleaned up. But these two, democracy and market, there is one fundamental contradiction which needs to be resolved by transformational leadership. Democracy means one man, one vote. And the majority in the country are not rich. In fact, overwhelming majority of the country is not rich amongst the voters. And on the other side, we have market for which you need capital as the driver and those skills that come with deployment of capital. And that's only a small minority. Only a small minority has that capital. So on one side you have people who are largely poor or relatively poor who are in majority. And on the other side you have a system which is run by a minority of the population. And the two have to be brought together. You have to have a market economy in the context of democracy. And there's a contradiction there. Because any time democracy can create such an atmosphere that the market is controlled. We do believe that the market is the best way to grow. More unregulated, the better, but of course there must be reasonable regulation. We can't be like the United States of America, which had hardly any regulations on their banks, and see what a mess they have ended up with. We need reasonable restrictions, of course. But at the same time, if the market services and provides profits only to the rich, then the democracy will react by electing a government which is left-wing. This has happened in so many places. What's happening in Latin America today? People who are hostile to the market are getting elected. Narasimha Rao doubled your rate of growth from 3.5% to 7% in 5 years. What happened to him in the elections? He lost the elections. What happened to Chandrababu Naidu? What happened to S.M. Krishna? These are people who have tried to liberalize the economy in their states, and they ended up. It's understandable. Over these last 40 years, the 40 years of 1950 to 1990, before we gave up the Soviet model, we built a whole superstructure, and a group of touts emerged in the situation who could get you a license, who could get you quotas, and in the process earn some money. And suddenly Narasimha Rao comes along and he removes these restrictions, these regulations, and they become poor in the sense they lose their rental value, their rental income, their black money income. There was a revolt of the touts in the 1990s which defeated Narasimha Rao. And Mr. Narasimha Rao ought to have realized that. I told him many times that when you are dealing with such transformations, some results must happen immediately. He said, what do you mean? I said, because all these deregulation, you are thinking of a filter down process, it will take a long time. The beneficiaries of the past system will lose immediately. The beneficiaries of the past systems will lose immediately. And the beneficiaries of the system to come, they will not realize their benefits for a long time, because the filtering down will take time. So you have to do some things which go directly. I suggested that he engage in massive construction of canals connecting rivers of India, because in India you have some rivers which are perpetually in surplus, and they create floods, and most of the water goes into the ocean. And there are rivers which are perpetually dry, or there's disputes on the amount of water, that is Kaveri, for example, between Karnataka and Tamil Nadu. So have canals, a grid, water grid. And when you start digging, then you are going to create employment. Then I said the other thing you can do to make the professional class, which is what is popularly called as the chattering class, because they talk all the time, create public opinion. I said abolish income tax. Because at that time, now it's a little more, at that time the income tax was only providing 2% of the revenue, 2% of the government revenue. I said the rich don't pay taxes because they've got chartered accountants. No offense to chartered accountants sitting here. And the poor don't have enough income to pay income tax. So who pays the income tax? The income tax is paid by professionals. They are paid by fixed income people. And they are harassed no end. And this is a powerful political class in the sense of creating opinion, so abolish it. And the money that goes will not be spent, it will go into the bank accounts, which will raise the level of investment. The level of investment will raise the level of growth rate of growth rate will then give you indirect taxes, which will be more than what you lose by abolishing income tax. But he did not accept this, and he paid a heavy price. So transformational leadership has to take into account all this. That is why today, in the United States, Harvard Business School, the Department of Education at Harvard, they all now teach what we have supposed to have known. All our rishis knew about the facets of our intelligence, the intelligence of a transformational leader. There too, it's multidimensional. Of course, now we'll start learning, because in India, many things we poo-poo when it's taught to us by our own people. But then when the white man teaches you, then we all accept it. For instance, we thought yoga was a joke. In the 1950s, people used to think yoga was a joke. It's all contortion, people used to say. At least those who went to convent education, through convent education. But then when the white man took to yoga, now yoga has become very popular here too. Similarly, meditation has come back to us. Recently, one very famous film actress called Julia Roberts became a Hindu along with the family. So I think Hinduism will also soon become very popular in our country. What our rishis taught is that intelligence is fivefold. There is something called cognitive intelligence, which means that, like physics, mathematics, that kind of thing. By your cognitive sense, you are able to draw the logic. Then there is something called emotional intelligence. And that emotional intelligence is how to speak in such a manner that you get the cooperation of the other. That's a communicating skill. If it is not balanced with the moral intelligence that follows with it, then you may get a Hitler who by sheer speaking mesmerized the people and made them do wrong things. So the third thing is moral intelligence. That there are some do's and don'ts that you will always observe. Just because you have more intelligence, you won't find more ways to be dishonest or more ways to cheat other people. Then there is something called social intelligence, where you have a conscience that if I have done well, then I must ensure that people around me also benefited and helped. That is not to be selfish. That's to have a civic consciousness. And then there is finally the major contribution of our rishis, something called spiritual intelligence, which now has become a part of their folklore in the United States when they teach intelligence. You can see that by going to Google and typing spiritual intelligence. You'll only see Western books. You will not see any of our Upanishads or anything quoted there. Spiritual intelligence is when you learn to link your mind to the cosmos, because the cosmos is full of knowledge. Those who are able to break boundaries and discover new things are those people who are able to meditate on this cosmos. And therefore, spiritual intelligence is sometimes called the neural Wi-Fi of your brain. So these are some of the aspects that we need. Unfortunately, we did not include this as part of our curriculum. Our educational system has been not equal to this. The first and foremost quality that a leader must have is vision. And it must be a dynamic vision that this is what I want for the society, for myself, my brothers, my sisters, my neighbors. A vision of how society should be when the time comes for him to go back to his maker. The second thing he must have is integrity. He must be true to values. And the third, and I consider this as important, he must have the courage of his conviction and the capacity to take risk. That is, he must have a backbone. Our Prime Minister today has definitely vision, definitely integrity, but he has no backbone, unfortunately. And that makes him incomplete. What he can do, wants to do, he can't do and won't do. There are people who don't even have integrity today. A large number of politicians today, the steering wheel of our society, they lack integrity. And of course, vision is something that's slowly being forgotten. We are acquiring an ideology which is not suitable to our country. When the rishis of this country talked about Sanatana Dharma, they did not say, don't aspire to make material progress. But they said material progress must be harmonized with spiritual values. And both must be developed together. That is the vision that we have lost. Today in the globalized world, it is making money. We have turned the Varna system, which has already become ossified and degenerate because of its connection with birth, and it has no reason to have connection with birth because DNA-wise, recent studies on DNA show that we are all one Indians. All our DNA is the same. We are not Aryans and Dravidians, the Aryans coming from Europe and the Dravidians coming from Africa. That was all bogus theory which the British taught you. And these words also have been concocted by them. There's no word Aryan in our Vedas. There's a word Arya, means a gentleman, accomplished person. The word Dravida was created by Adi Shankara, who when he went to Mandara Mishra to debate him in Varanasi, was asked, who are you? He said, I'm Dravida Shishu. A sandhi of two words, Tra and Vid, to mean where the three oceans meet, or the three coastlines meet. That means South India. Yet we have a chief minister in Tamil Nadu called Karunanidhi, who says Dravida is a separate nation. And all Rama was an Aryan. In fact, he told me one day that Rama was a Brahmin. I said, no, he was Kshatriya. Then I told him, on the other hand, Ravan was a Brahmin. He didn't believe it till I brought the Tamil Ramayana and showed it to him. Since then he has stopped praising Ravan, but he still attacks Rama. But that will also change because a few months ago, when I was fighting this in the Supreme Court, the case that the government has no right to break the Ram Setu, to build a canal, he got angry in a public meeting. He said, who is this Swami to say this is Ram Setu? Rama? Was he an engineering graduate that he built a Setu? Next day he fell ill and he was admitted to Ramchandra Medical Hospital. So our brains have been washed by the British. And we should have changed the history books in 1947 to say that we are one people, and that includes Muslims and Christians also. They may be of different religion, but their ancestors were Hindus. That's what the DNA studies show. So therefore, these ideas have to be now, we have to undergo a major mental revolution. This transformational leadership cannot come unless we undergo a mental revolution. We cannot progress in this country or any country with a one-dimensional focus on materialism. Grow materially. Why would Julia Roberts become a Hindu? She is a very rich person. Why do all these sadhus and sannyasis have so many foreigners flocking to it? Go to the ashram of Sri Sri Ravi Shankar or Swami Dayanand Saraswati or Ramdev. These people are not westernized people. Many of them can't even speak in English. But you see flocks of foreigners there. In America, there are so many ashrams have come up. And the Americans go after them, say, give us mental peace, teach us how to get mental peace. Even I am troubled because my name is Swami, but I'm not a real Swami. I'm just by name a Swami. And I get telephone calls when I go to teach every year at Harvard and my name is in the directory, you will get bombarded with telephone calls. Because of all this material prosperity, they have not been able to become happy. You cannot become happy unless you balance this material progress with spiritual advancement. This blend, this harmonization is what we call the Sanatana Dharma. It's got nothing to do specifically whether you believe in Rama or Krishna or Muhammad or Christ. It is an attitude to life. And it is this, in this globalized world, the opportunities are many to make money, looking for shortcuts, that has now created this flood of corruption in our country. Look at what has happened in the telecom scandal, 2G spectrum. Well, first of all, many people ask me, what is this 1G, 2G, 3G? Somebody asked Manmohan Singh, he says, well, I know only two. Somebody asked Manmohan Singh, do you know 2G? He said, yes, Sonia Ji and Rahul Ji. And for him, that's the important direction. Anyway, it is, after all, different frequencies. If you take a cordless phone, the communication, your voice goes over a wave, but the wave has long cycles, and therefore only your voice goes in it. The flatter is the wave, the less is the information. Then 2G, more waves. 3G is even more waves. And they carry more information. So if it's 2G, you can send emails, you can send photographs, you can send videos, you can send MMS, which you can't do in a cordless phone. And 3G means you can even see who the other person is who picks up the phone. So it's more and more information as the number of frequencies increase. That's all it is. There's no mystery in it. And there is a big demand because there's a huge market in our country. Mr. Raja chose that he will have the prices of 2001, and he sold it in 2008 in the prices of 2001. And he said, first come, first served. And he put a cutoff date, and he ensured that only his favorites got the lion's share of the license. And what did the favorites do? They went and sold it to foreign companies. One sold it to Etisalat, another sold it to Telenor. Now the Home Ministry has a report, and this matter is in court. The Home Ministry has a report which said that Etisalat is controlled by ISI of Pakistan. It's of course a Dubai-based company, and said that one of the board of directors is a close associate of Dawood Ibrahim. In America, no foreign company is allowed to be a server, which is supposed to be a free market. But in our country, by the back door, they have all come. Telenor has contracts with this Chinese People's Liberation Army, the Chinese PLA. And so not only is the fact that you undersold it, but they sold it at 8 times the price. Those who got the licenses here at this low price of 2001, they were able to sell it at 8 times the price to foreigners who are now going to build towers. And then they will be able to do all kinds of surveillance. They can put a software in your mobile phone which will enable them to trace you. Even if the Prime Minister doesn't carry a mobile phone, his Chaprasi carries a mobile phone, who goes around with him wherever he goes. No Neta can go anywhere without Chaprasi with him. So this is the danger, that from corruption, we are now sacrificing our national security. Of course, Raja can't do it himself. There must be some Rani behind him to help him out. I know who that Rani is, and you will see it in the newspapers one of these days very soon when I go to court on it. But what we find is that there is defense of the indefensible going on. Bullying the people who had the courage to come out. The CAG had the courage to come out and document the whole thing. The minister, Mr. Kapil Sibal, who is no transformational leader at all, because when VP Singh was the Prime Minister, he was his additional Solicitor General. And before he became additional Solicitor General, when VP Singh came out in a protest demonstration, there is a video which shows Kapil Sibal saying, "Gali gali mein shor hai, Rajiv Gandhi chor hai." And today he says that this is all maligning of one particular person. So what happens is that we have a situation where the whole vitals of this country is being eroded, cut by corruption, and that is because greed has taken over our country. Mahatma Gandhi had said, let us become trustees of India's wealth. United States even today keeps a balance by philanthropy. Compare how much they donate in the United States, the rich people, compared to what our rich people donate. As a proportion of income, I'm not saying you should donate in the same $1 billion as they do, but as a proportion of your money, your profit, how much do you donate? After all, if you donate for innovation, India will expand. Universities are starving, schools don't have money. And you get tax exemption if you spend money on that, and yet people are not doing it. It's because greed. That's behind the lack of transformational leadership today. Get as much money as you can. In the parliament today, I would say 75% at least, maybe more, of the MPs are honest. They come walking to the parliament, or they take a bus, or the specially designated cars which parliament supplies from key points to parliament. But when they come to fight an election, they have to rely on these corrupt people to get the finances for it. And that is why a few people can control the system. And that system today has become a cartel system. There's an understanding. People ask me, why is it that you are able to do alone, go to court, get all these things done, why these other people are not doing? Because they are part of a cartel. I am not part of a cartel, that's why they say, he is all alone, he has nobody, he has no party. I don't want to be part of this cartel. If the people arise, then I know things can change. In the emergency when I was fighting alone, people used to say, what is the use of this fighting you are doing? Because Mrs. Indira Gandhi is so solidly set. How will the emergency ever go? Will you have a violent overthrow? I said, no. Democracy. Democratic method. He said, by democratic method, it's not going to go. But on 18th January 1977, Mrs. Gandhi declared an election. On March 25th, 1977, she lost the election. Who could have foreseen that Mrs. Gandhi will declare the election? And even if I had foreseen, could I have said it to the public, they would have laughed at me. And who could have foreseen that she would lose the elections? Not only she will lose the election, our son will lose the election, and our party will lose every seat in Madhya Pradesh and Uttar Pradesh and Bihar. So I could not have foreseen. So therefore, to fight, it's not an overwhelming problem today. We need now to make people as examples. 2 years ago in January, Satyam Raju, Satyam, that's why I say India's old slogan is now Satyam Spectrum Sundaram. Not Satyam Shivam Sundaram. And what is Sundaram? Even today there is hope. And I am very much encouraged by the reaction of the people after the Supreme Court verdict or the Supreme Court orders on the 2G spectrum. Length and breadth of the country, people have awakened. They write to me. So therefore, in the fight against corruption, notice what happened. Satyam Raju made a press conference, confessed, I have done this fraud on the balance books, on the books. At the same time, Bernard Madoff, he confessed in New York that I have done fraud with the pension funds. And I am ready to take any punishment, as Satyam Raju said. In 6 months, Bernard Madoff was found guilty and sent to jail for 150 years. 150-year sentence he is now facing, with no parole. Whereas Satyam Raju, he is in air-conditioned hospital. The charge sheet has still not been even framed by the police. Been prepared by the police. It is this which is making people unhappy. That is why I recently went to the trial court, to the Tisazari court, the criminal court, and filed a criminal complaint against Raja and told the judge, you appoint me as public prosecutor. He said, how can I appoint you? You are not a government lawyer. I said, but the law says I can be appointed. He said, show it to me. I read it out. Section 5 of the Prevention of Corruption Act says that I can be. He said, I never knew such a law existed. I said, you're the judge and you didn't know? Because never in the history, I told him no lawyer is going to read out this for you because they will lose their job. So they will keep it suppressed. And there's a Supreme Court judgment also that yes, it's constitutionally valid to have a private individual appointed as public prosecutor. If I'm appointed, which is I'm expecting on the 5th, there's a lot of resistance from the CBI because it says this man is snatching our bread. But the CBI is always easily under pressure. If I become public prosecutor, within 4 months I'll have Raja inside jail. That much I can tell you. Of course, afterwards I'll go looking for the Rani also. But that's a different, I will do it by stages. This country just needs that. I can prove it to you mathematically. I prove it in the class in America by using the statistical technique of expected value. And I can show to you by expected value that even if the probability of catching a corrupt person is low, if the price he has to pay upon being caught is very, very high, then every person on his own calculus of survival will not be corrupt. And that's the rule which the Americans practice. When they catch, they really hit the book on them. Enron was such a famous corporation. It was in the Fortune 500 companies, the best administered company. And Enron, Skilling, and all the top executives were handcuffed and taken through the streets of Washington, D.C. They don't hesitate once you do it. That's the strong point of the United States. There is corruption in the United States, but once they catch you, they won't let you go. That tenacity is what you need. And along with that, an attitude of risk. Because we Indians play safe. We want the safest way to do things, not to lose whatever you have. Little more you can get, fine, but not to lose what you have. Every year at the end of my class at Harvard, I ask the students, because I have about 40 students and they come from about 20 countries, 20, 25 countries. And I ask them, now that the course is over and you get to go and get a job, what kind of job will you take? a job where you will enter service and your salary is fixed. Every year it will go up by 5%, and at the end of the age of 65, you will get $1 million in your provident fund. You want that kind of a job? Or you want a job where you take chances, you become a billionaire, or you become a complete pauper because your luck has gone against you and you fall flat out. The American students will ask me, what's the probability of losing everything? But the Indian students invariably will say, no, we want the first job. So I would tell the Indian students, why the first job? That's guaranteed poverty. Why do you want that? You can be a billionaire here. Yes, they say, yes, it may be guaranteed poverty, but it is guaranteed. That is why we like it. Risk-taking must be built into your brain by your parents. You should not be told to take the easy way out. You should not be told to play safe. You should be told to take risk. And if you take a risk for the country, then you are doing a great big service. I will say this is the the biggest lacuna in our transition, the leadership of our country in all sectors. And it is that we need in the 21st century. Because 21st century, as everybody knows, economic growth is led by innovations. Innovations means, and we have a young population. We have the youngest population in the world today, and the largest. 28 years is the average age of an Indian population. The average age of the Chinese is 38. The average age of the Japanese is 49. And therefore, this young population, if you educate them well and teach them to take risk, which is required in innovations, then I can tell you, India can become a very, very great country. It was a great country once upon a time, only 400, 500 years ago. Even then we were a great country. Our decline started from 1100, but even as late as 1750, we were considered more developed country by outsiders. And that's because that time the psychological makeup was different. We may have lost to foreigners coming and attacking us. That was not because we were inferior, but because our cultural system, we did not change. We had rules of warfare which the enemy never understood and never obeyed and never cared for, and we lost because of that. Our rules of war were very simple. No fighting before sunrise, no fighting after sunset. After sunset, go back to your tambu and have a good night's sleep. That was the rule. And similarly, you could not fight in the villages, inside the town. You could not fight in the agricultural fields. You had to fight in the open Maidan. So when Ravan had to fight Rama, he came out of his fort into the open Maidan. Kurukshetra was an open Maidan. And finally, if after losing you ask for mercy, everything will be returned to you and you will be given a send-off. And so Muhammad Ghori came 17 times, each time Prithviraj Chauhan forgave him and sent him back, till he finally lost. It was Shivaji who understood that when Afzal Khan called him for dinner, there is no shishtachar in this, there is no etiquette in this, I better go prepared. And he went prepared and came out alive. The rules of the game have completely changed. The globalization is a very, very risky affair today for us. It has destabilized the whole international system. If you get into this greed, which means a single-minded devotion to material welfare, then society will not survive. You need values, and these values are already there in our Upanishads, in the Vedas, and our Shastras. They are there in every religion, but I can only speak for that religion which I know best. And consequently, we should all resolve from today that we will have a vision for the sake of the country, that we will have an integrity, that we will not do unethical things to cut corners and look for shortcuts, and that for the sake of the country, the sake of the family, the sake of the future, you will take risk. Then India will become a great country through transformational leadership. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Swami. That was a truly remarkable all-round coverage of various aspects of transformational leadership, ranging from dharma to culture to economy to politics. I've got a whole bunch of questions with me, which I'm sure whenever we get a political leader in front of us, the questions are bound to be there. But we have one more session to follow, so I'll be able to take only one or two out of this whole bunch of questions. So this first question, though the person has not mentioned his name, but I feel it must be from one of our cheerful students sitting here. And the person wants to know, what are your views on indulging the young blood in our Indian political society, whether it will foster our growth rate?
Well, there's a balance that has to be worked out here. This country is a very complex country, and therefore you need experience. You need experience in great measure to run this country. And therefore, if you get a position of power at an early age without the necessary experience, then of course you may not be able to deliver. And I've got this because after the Bofors incident, I think about the only close friend Rajiv Gandhi had left was myself. Most people had abandoned him, and with him I had collaborated to form the Chandrasekhar government. I'm not defending Rajiv Gandhi as to what he didn't do or did do in the Bofors matter, but he had many other good qualities. And therefore I supported him. And he told me that the biggest mistake I made is becoming Prime Minister at the age of 40. I said, why? If you think the problems were so enormous that you didn't know the solution, you could have called any expert, put them before you and asked them for an opinion. He said, yes. The only problem was that the experts never gave me one opinion. If there were 5 experts, they gave me 6 opinions. And I didn't know which one to pick. So that is the problem. And today you see large number of young people are there in politics. But they happen to be sons and daughters of various people, and they think they are only looking for the escalator to high positions. We need actually those people, young people in politics, who are willing to stand up on their feet. But then they must have the support of their families. Because this is a profession where you can go through very hard times, and you need a family to support you. Without that, it can't be done. And unfortunately, in our society today, the atmosphere is that politics is dirty. Politics is not dirty. Politicians are dirty, but politics is not dirty. And if you go to our tradition, Ramayana and Mahabharata is nothing but politics. Politics is as I said, the steering wheel of society. And therefore, we need a new national ethos that going into politics, even if I can't go, anybody goes, I will support him. Not today the way we say, it's politics, dirty politicians. You go look at the matrimonial column of Hindustan Times. Please try as a dummy advertisement, wanted able girl, educated girl for son who's a politician. You'll get no answers at all. I remember when I was recruiting youngsters, one youngster came to me after a meeting, he said, I want to join. I said, join? Just now you can join. He said, no, my parents are objecting. but I'm so keen, you must come and talk to my parents. So I went and spoke to his parents. I said, the country needs young people. I'll train them, I'll look after them, see that they get the right values. To that, the father said, no, he's a very bright boy, I want him to become a doctor. So I said, you want him to become a doctor? What about the country? He said, you want somebody for politics? Take my second son, he's good for nothing. I have no use for him. Take him into politics. This mental makeup must go. But in the United States, look at Obama. He's a Harvard Law graduate and he was top of the class. Bush has a degree from the Harvard Business School. I have seen in Harvard they have political clubs where they train each other to get into politics. But our society is not yet equipped for it. So I welcome young people, but they must say, I will stand on my own feet. I will not ask the party to give me anything. I will give the party. Today, unfortunately, party gives everything to the worker and everybody is corrupted. The kind of money you need, if the money comes from top to the bottom, from the central party to the district, to run the political party, then you need money in crores, which can only be if some 2G scam comes along. You cannot get it by donations. You won't get enough. It has to be at the micro level. So that kind of mind, so easy, it's easy for youngsters. First start with the area you live in. Collect 11 people who are like you. Create a committee. And then from there, how to proceed further, I'll be happy to assist. That's what I want to say.
I have a mandate for, say, a few more questions. So I have got this question from Mr. Rakesh Jain. And Mr. Rakesh Jain wants to know, sir, what do you think we need in terms of priority? Strong, charismatic leader or effective governing system?
There is no such thing as a charismatic leader. This is a cinema world creation. I think in Tamil Nadu, we have been ruined by all these charismatic leaders. What you need is, as I say, three things: vision, integrity, guts. So these three things, if there is, and of course a governance system is necessary, institutions are necessary, then anybody can contribute to the politics of India. This charisma business is an artificial creation. It has no value in political life. It certainly has value in the cinema world, but not in political life.
I have got a whole lot of questions on one particular issue, which I'm sure is the talk of the town nowadays. Sir, Mr. S.S. Bhatia, Vice Chairman, Bhatia International Limited, and he is asking a question: what steps Indian government should take to get black money from foreign countries back to the India?
Which Indian government? The one I'm in or the one I'm not in? Because methods are known to everybody. Look at this 26 names which Germany has given you without doing any work. The government is afraid to publish their list, that the Supreme Court has to rebuke them. So it's not a question of lack of methods. I can tell you one method which is perfectly feasible, which may scare some of you who have Swiss bank accounts. And that is, declare all accounts of Indians who have Indian passports as nationalized, as belonging to India, and communicate this to Switzerland, and with a rider that if anyone comes and says, my money was legitimately deposited and here is the proof for it, I will return that account. You will get all the accounts because nobody there nobody in his right mind would ever have an honest account in Switzerland because they don't pay you any interest. Interest, now those who put money abroad are earning money on ill-gotten money through the participatory note route. So that's a different matter. But the fact of the matter is that there are many, many ways of doing it. How did Germany get its accounts? It bribed an officer working in the Liechtenstein Bank, gave him a large amount of money, $500 million, and they got $70 billion back because the people they prosecuted with German citizenship, they were able to recover $70 billion. So there are many methods of doing it. And I don't think that that is the problem. The problem is that the people must make this the issue and accordingly not go by charisma and the cinema, etc., or by what the newspaper says, but by his quality as you know it. Even if he is not a member of any political party, he is an independent, people start voting for him. When that happens, the change will automatically come.
I'm sure this session can go on and on and on, and queries will keep on flowing from the audience. But now I would like to offer our token of gratitude to our esteemed guest here. May I now request Mr. Purushottam Pasari, Managing Trustee, Shri Vaishnav Institute of Management, to please present a memento to Dr. Subramaniam Swamy. Thank you, Mr. Pasari. Thank you, Dr. Swamy. We all are really indebted to you for your enlightening speech. Thank you very much, sir.